Look at this guy. What does he scream at you?
Harshness?
Maybe, I don't know. What else?
He looks kind of
What does he look at you? What does he remind you of? It is European, right? What's this subject? Does he look Middle Eastern? No. Not really. In fact, if you were to guess the country, what would he look like? English. Very much English. And so why are we looking at an Englishman when we're talking about Middle East colonization?
just they were influenced by the English.
Yes. Now, before I give you this daily quiz, let's just remind you a tiny bit about the world, right? So here's England. Here's France. Belgium. Spain. Germany. Big things in between. Italy. Okay. Greece is kind of a horseshoe. And it's tied over to Turkey. So we go down here and we come up to the bottom of the Mediterranean. And we go up here. Okay, that's kind of North Africa. There's a big island here. There's a big island here, big island there, and then a bunch of other ones. Now the thing is that this isn't really totally accurate because you also know that there's a big lake here, right? So that's okay. We'll just put some water here. We'll put that. You know that there's Nile here. You also know that there's the Mediterranean, the Mesopotamian, because it's between the two rivers. So you have to have pictures of the two rivers. So then we go on to the rest of the landmass. You know that Africa kind of comes up here, and Saudi Arabia is this big little trapezoid. And then you come down here, and when you get over here, you get into India, which is a great big kite. And then once you get to India, you've got China, you've got Southeast Asia, you've got Korea, you've got Japan, and then all this kind of like Russia. Okay? And Africa kind of comes down like this. And you happen to know Southeast Asia that you have a couple of islands, and then there's Australia, and then there's New Zealand. Okay? So that's the entire world, right? What do you really need to know about it, except some basic parts? You need to know India, right? You need to know China. You need to know Korea. You need to know Southeast Asia. You need to know Japan. We don't talk about Australia, but I suppose you should know it. You should know Africa, right? But really, for Africa, you need to know that there's a great big, giant, enormous desert here. And so the main civilization to the north is going to be Egypt, right? So you need to know that this is Egypt, and it's Egypt primarily because of the Nile. And then you have all these little spots that are kind of along the north coast. You should know about Spain, right? France is a big deal. Germany is a big deal. England, and since we hate to forget Ireland, there's Ireland, but really, we don't really care about Ireland yet. You need to know Belgium, because Belgium is kind of right between France and Germany. You should probably know Denmark, because Danes are here somewhere. You should probably know that there are also, up here, big countries. Anybody happen to know what those big countries are? Yes? Very good. Norway, Sweden, Finland, right? In fact, going up here, there's also some Baltic states. We don't really care about them. There's Balkan states. We don't really care about them. We do need to know about Greece and Italy. We need to know about Russia, except this is so deceptive, aside from the fact that nothing's to scale. But what's really deceptive about Russia? When we say Russia, what are we really talking about? Are we talking about the entire region from here to there?
No.
No, truly not. Yes, it stretches, but really, Russia is here. And then they just own this spot. It's one of the kind of the vulnerabilities of Russia. When do they actually get people over here, like systematically?
1900s.
Pretty much. Prior to that, late 1800s, you have the Trans-Siberian Railroad. Okay, just like we have it in the United States, but it's not really just like we have it in the United States. There's one rail. That's all there ever is. And they don't get, even today, you cannot easily get on a highway and zoom over to the other coast. United States, there are dozens and dozens of highways that let you go from one coast to the other coast. We are completely a developed country, not in the United States, not in the Soviet Union or Russia. And so we're talking about this is actually the base. When we talk about Europe, this is the West. This is kind of that dividing line in the West. Okay? We've talked about this in this class numerous times. The Western civilization versus the Eastern civilization. And Russia kind of goes on both sides of it. I don't have it here, but we should probably talk about Mongolia, right? Why is Mongolia kind of important? The Mongols, right? The Mongol horde, the ones that took over China. In fact, the reason why Russia expands from here to there is because the Mongols were the first ones to do it. The Mongols are the ones that basically start up the Moscow area. Now, eventually, these people here in Eastern Rome, the Byzantine Empire, will go up, and they will be the first princes of Russia. These will be in the late 1400s, hundreds of years after the Mongols. So they're going to really inherit a structure that was already there under Russia. And so the reason why we talk about this is that where does Russia fit? Is it Eastern or is it Western? This is a lot easier to answer than we think. Is it Eastern or Western?
Eastern.
Western, totally Western. Right? Because even though it expands, where is the heart of Russia? Here. Now, Levi's not incorrect, because when we think about Eastern, what you're really talking about is in terms of Eastern Europe and Western Europe. And that line is around here. What distinguishes between Eastern Europe, and you've heard that phrase, Eastern Europe and Western Europe. What is it that distinguishes? Go ahead.
Was it the wall?
It will be, yes. But we had these ideas even before World War II. There's a couple of other countries here, right? Poland is here. Czechoslovakia is in here. Remember I told you about the Baltic states up here. You've got Georgia, which is Ukraine, but this will become Russia. But there are little regions in here. Austria-Hungary, great big country there, right? Yes?
Does that fit like the Byzantine or the Ottoman Empire?
Well, the Byzantine Empire, remember, is Turkey, right? But before 1453. Rome, maybe you don't know this. I thought I told you. Go ahead.
Yeah, it's split.
It's split into two. So Rome had all of this, and it's split into two under Diocletian in 300. And so you have the Eastern Empire and the Western Empire. Western Empire was where the capital of Rome was, but when they made this division, they had shifted the capital away from Rome and they turned it to Constantinople. What city did Constantinople end up becoming? I say this because there's a song associated with it. You guys should all know the song. What is it? Istanbul, Constantinople. Okay, so you've got Eastern Europe divided by the corporate knowledge base inherited by the fall of Rome. What was the religion of the Byzantine Empire prior to 1000 AD? It's a really easy answer.
Catholic.
Catholic. It's Christian. It's Catholic. Catholic. So too is the West. Where's the Pope? He's in Rome, Vatican in Rome, right? In 1053, the emperor was still in the Byzantine Empire, but there was no empire in Europe. We talked about this. The Middle Ages was the absence of a nation state. And yet the Pope was still the head of the church, the first among equals, the first apostle, the chair of Peter. And so here you have this really weird situation where the only remaining empire of Rome is living right here. This is the Byzantine Empire. And yet, the authority for the church is right here in kind of the wastelands where there's no empire at all. And it's the Pope. And of course, this leads to a great deal of resentment. So much resentment that in 1053, the Orthodox, the Eastern Roman Empire, which we call the Byzantine Empire, broke away from the Catholic Church. They did not change a single doctrine, not even minimally. They simply did not respect the primacy of Peter. And so we call these Orthodox Catholic, Eastern Orthodox. Orthodox, Russian Orthodox, Greek Orthodox, Antiochian Orthodox. This isn't something probably your textbook gets a lot into, but you should know that they're both Catholic. Catholic, hopefully you understand, is not a title. It's not like Presbyterian or Methodist. They didn't say we're going to be the Catholics, rah, rah, rah. Catholic was a title, and it means universal. It's Latin. If you read the Apostles' Creed, we believe in one holy Catholic and Apostolic Church. Catholic is not capitalized. It's a short, it's a small letter, because it's a descriptor. Catholic means universal. And so up until 1,000 years, there was one church, period. That's it. You had one head. And so in 1053, you have a division. And there's a split. The doctrine remains exactly the same. Except that in the West, they respect what's called the primacy of Peter. And the primacy of Peter is the Pope. And in the East, they have what's called autocephalous. And you guys all know your Latin, so you know what that means, right? Each bishop chosen by local politics. It's why they call Russian Orthodox, Greek Orthodox, Antiochian Orthodox, and Ethiopian Orthodox. Because each region is chosen. So they don't accept the primacy of Peter. In Catholicism, Roman Catholicism, when we say Roman Catholic, we're talking about the West. One Jesus, right? So Jesus appoints one Peter, upon this rock I'll build my church, and so they recognize the primacy of Peter. Well, Peter's obviously dead, but there's always some person who's kind of the head. In the Orthodox, they don't do that. You can understand where this comes from. This is not a theological difference between autocephalous. Autocephalous comes because the emperor hates the fact that he has to listen to the Pope. So he makes his own bishop. They're not called bishops here, they're called metropolitans. Or, sometimes, politans, they're called patriarchs. The patriarch of the Russian Orthodox Church. It's kind of like Pope, except there's like 15 of them. Right? Autocephalous means auto head. So it's your own head. That's what it means, literally. So in Russia, they have their head of their local church. In Greece, they have their head of their local church. In Jerusalem, you have the Jerusalem Orthodox Church. They have their head in Jerusalem. I don't want to get too much into this, but you should kind of know the difference here is that in the East, it's the politics that really determines this. In the West, totally removed. So what's the difference between Eastern Europe and Western? Did you get it? What's the difference between Eastern Europe and Western Europe?
A quick side question.
Good.
What happened to the West when the East broke away? There wasn't like a unifying place, right? It wasn't unified.
Well, remember, Catholicism is not bound by politics. Separation of church and state. It's a Christian idea. It's not an American idea. It's a Christian idea. I told you this. You guys know. Well, if you don't know the gospel, there's a gospel story where they're trying to trap Jesus. I thought I told you this. And the Pharisees come up to him and say, "Should you pay taxes?" And remember, Jesus is in Israel. And Israel is overtaken by the Romans. And so you have Jews that feel great resentment by the fact that the Romans are taking them over. At the other hand, you have the Romans who are not going to tolerate any question of insurrection. So two opposing sides. So how do you answer this as a Jew? And Jesus is a Jewish rabbi, right? And so they ask him, should you pay taxes to Caesar? Because if he says, yes, you should pay taxes to Caesar, what has he done to all the Jews? Kind of alienated, right? Especially since he's the Messiah. What's the Messiah supposed to do? The Messiah is supposed to kind of restore Israel. Now, we know in Christianity, when they say restore Israel, he's not talking about politics, he's talking about heaven, he's talking about something different. But if you say, you're the Messiah, that I'm going to restore Israel, and you should still pay taxes, That's a problem. You alienate all these people who may look at you as Messiah. On the other hand, let's say he says, I don't think you should pay taxes. What would the Romans do in a heartbeat? You get arrested. So it's deliberately intended to get him in trouble. But of course, Jesus is God, so it's not a big deal. He doesn't get swine by this. What's his answer? Does anybody know this story? None of you guys know this story?
I've heard it, but I can't remember.
Do you know the story?
Doesn't he hold up a coin and say this is the emperor's face?
He holds up a coin. He says, whose face is on this coin? It's the emperor's coin. And he says, render unto Caesar what is Caesar, and render unto God what is God's. Now, if you went to church over Easter, it was one of the big points is that when he gets to be crucified, he says, are you king of the Jews? And Jesus says, I am not king of this world. I am not of this world. It's kind of one of the whole points of Christian salvation, that heaven is not here. The goal isn't for God to come down and make heaven on earth. Heaven is not of this world. Jesus is not the king of this world. And when he says, render unto Caesar what is Caesar's, and render unto God what is God's, the politics is of this world. God and heaven is of the other world. This sense of a separation of church and state is part and parcel of the whole mission of Christianity. And so the Pope doesn't determine who the political leader is. So the question you asked, really good question. What happened when they broke away? Did any of the kings get upset? No. Because that's not what the church is. Now, people were upset. The Pope was upset, right? Because you see a break in the fabric of the church. But the Orthodox didn't change any theology. There was nothing that was changed. Just simply saying we're not going to listen to Peter. And so it was called the Schism. One of the reasons why we had the Crusades 50 years later is that the emperor in the Byzantine Empire is being attacked by these new group of Muslims. They've had Muslims there for 300 years. But there's a new group, Seljuk Turks. And I should point them out. You don't know this, but the Seljuk Turks are from here. This is right next to Mongolia. They're not from the Middle East or anything. And they've all kind of been moving this direction, migrating that direction. When they get into the Middle East, they shake up everything, and it causes more pressure on the Byzantine Empire. And the Byzantine Empire is losing to these guys. And so they ask Europe, do you have any knights? The knights of Europe are unique. They're like tanks. People are really good on their horses, and they've got armor, and they're able to fight in a way that none of the other countries are fighting. And part of it is because of the feudalism, because each lord is basically like his own little king. And so you have a whole bunch of these kings that are really good at just being their own leaders. And you don't have that in the Byzantine Empire. And so he sends a note, could you give me some of your knights? But the Pope hears about this. He goes up and he says, this is a good thing. If we can help the Byzantine Empire, then maybe they will come back to us. And that was one of the reasons why we supported the Crusades. And the Crusades wasn't a war by the church. Hopefully you guys know that, because the church has no military, never has had a military. There's been a rule against priests even carrying swords from the first century. There's no military in the church. And yet, the church always has influence. The church says, this would be good. Go help our brothers. Go help our brothers in the West. That's what starts in the Crusades. Well, Crusades have a varied story, and we'll talk about it. The point is that it doesn't cause them to become united. So then I go back to this question. How does that impact the East and Western Europe? What is it that distinguishes Eastern Europe from Western Europe? So the emperor is getting upset about these new Seljuk Turks coming in. We have this Crusades. The Crusades last from around 1100 to the middle of the 1200s. Well, they're not successful. So what ends up happening to the Byzantine empires? 200 years later, less than 200 years, about 150 years later, what's going to happen to the last of the Byzantine Empire? They're going to be taken over, right? The Turks are going to take over. What's the name of now what used to be the Byzantine Empire? What do we call it now? Turkey, right? They're the ones who took it over. So where did the leaders of the Byzantine Empire go? They didn't just sit there and become, Muslim. They went north to Russia. And I think I told you guys this, right? What's the leader of Russia called?
Czar?
The Tsar. Where does Tsar come from?
Caesar?
Caesar. Right? They are the inheritance of the Byzantine Empire. So then I'll ask one more time. What's the difference between Eastern Europe and Western Europe? The East call themselves Orthodox. The West call themselves Roman Catholic. And so the difference between Eastern Europe and Western Europe is entirely religious. What's the religion of Russia? Russian Orthodox.
What does that word mean?
Orthodoxy? Good. Orthodoxy means that you are stringent on the rules. To be Orthodox is to be stringent. The Orthodox did not break away from Rome. They don't believe that they did. If you talk to an Orthodox Catholic, he'll say that they excommunicated Rome because they thought that Rome was changing, because they didn't believe in the primacy of the Pope, and they thought that the Pope was doing things that he shouldn't. He wasn't. Not an issue. There was really no theology that they're talking about. But they call themselves Orthodox because they think they are more traditional. In fact, if you go to an Orthodox service, it does feel like you're going back to like the 5th century. Their liturgy is very long and very ornate, and it could easily be something that you could see happening around the 4th or 5th century. And they do change much slower than what's happening in the West. The Catholic Mass is relatively short, and it's only changed maybe a few times in the last 500 or 600 years. Nevertheless, Eastern Europe and Western Europe was mostly defined by the differences in religion. This is kind of important. Why is it important? What distinguishes the Middle East from Europe? Remember, back in the old days, it was Eastern Rome and Western Rome. Well, all of this was the same origin. When Rome died, it sent its corporate knowledge into Europe. It sent its corporate knowledge into Russia. It's the same spot. And yet today, we don't think of this at all as European. What is this area today? We call it Middle East. Why? What distinguishes it?
The religion.
What is it?
Muslim.
Islam. So when we look at the West, there are 3 main religions in the West. What are those 3 main religions? And this is going to be a trick question, but I'm going to ask it anyway. What are the 3 main religions of the West? Whip out the easy ones. Christianity. Very good. Okay. What's the other one?
Judaism.
Ah, you were not tricked. Very good. Okay, why didn't you say Orthodoxy and Catholicism?
Because Catholicism is Christian.
Yeah, because they're both Christian. There's no, you didn't break anything. Orthodox, you didn't become un-Christian. They're still Christian. Okay, and later in the 1500s, when the Protestants break away, they don't become another religion. They're still Christian. They don't accept, not only do they not accept the primacy of the Pope, but they don't accept the primacy of what we would call tradition. This is a theological thing I don't want to get too much into, but they don't believe in one holy Catholic and Apostolic Church. Catholic even as a little c, not the difference between Orthodox and Roman Catholic. They don't believe in one holy church. And so they believe that God speaks to people individually, not through the church. This is different, but it's still Christian. So the 3 main Christians in the West, the 3 main religions in the West, Christianity, Judaism, and Islam. And we talked about this before. What is the characteristic that all 3 of these share?
Monotheism.
Monotheism. Boom, on the ball. So you guys are super smart. And so what are the religions, the main religions in the East?
Hinduism.
Hinduism is a big one. We haven't really talked much about this, although I've talked about it like over and over again, but not a lot in detail. What else then?
Buddhism.
Buddhism, absolutely. Even though, oddly enough, Buddhism is atheistic. It's still religion. There's a third one that was religion, then it shifted into a philosophy. Taoism. Very good. Okay. And this is difficult because Taoism because it shifted into a philosophy, because there's something else that's really kind of more descriptive than any of these things. It's another religion. Boom, on the ball, super smart, okay? And because none of these guys actually have a moral code that's fit in with the religion, where does the moral philosophy come from? Confucianism, mainly in China and to the east. Okay. India would have its moral philosophy from Hinduism, but Hinduism does not go outside of India. A little bit in Southeast Asia, I shouldn't say that. But why not? Well, we'll talk about that. So your main philosophical stuff comes from Confucianism. Well, what is it that characterizes all of these guys?
Polytheism.
Polytheism. Okay. So when we look at this big map, and we see the division between the East and the West, polytheism, it kind of defines the East. But is there a connection between your religion and your politics? Oh yeah. Absolutely. In fact, we talked about that when we talked about Japan and China. How they approach life, science, the world, the material world, heavily influenced by their cultural beliefs, particularly their religious beliefs. What about in the West? West is monotheistic, all right? And is there a connection between the religion and politics? Of course there is. Judaism, Christianity, Islam. Where does Judaism fit in here? Is there a government of Judaism? Not since the time of Israel in Roman times. And then in 72 AD, Rome destroyed Israel. And so when did we get another Israel? 1948, with the creation of modern Israel. Right? So what happened in between? Where did the Jews go? You happen to know the term? You may not know the term. It's called diaspora. Again, you guys know your Latin. What does that mean? Just look at it. What does it look like? Diaspora. The beautiful thing about it being Latin is that almost all of our words have some connection to it. So you look at the word, you can make a pretty good guess. What's another word that seems like it in English? Disperse. Ah! That's it. Diaspora. Disperse. That's exactly what the word is. And so what happened to the Jews? They went all over the place, right? So there's Jews everywhere, but they're kind of a minority everywhere. And so we don't look and say, well, that country is defined by Judaism, because it's not there anymore. So when we define Eastern and Western Europe, it's not, Judaism doesn't have a part in it. It's whether it's Roman Catholic or Orthodox. And then what about Islam and Christianity? Are these compatible with each other? No. Yes, you can be Christian and live in an Islamic society. Yes, you can be Islamic and live in a Christian society. You cannot have both in the same government. Very difficult to have both. You can, but very difficult. And so the Middle East is defined by that Islam.
Are you going to go over like their way of government? Like
Exactly, specifically. That's what we're going to do today. Who was the first one to make a connection? And we didn't talk about this in class. This would be your common knowledge. Who was the first one to make a connection between Greece, and Egypt, and Mesopotamia? And India. Yeah.
The Ottoman Empire.
Before. Very famous guy. Say his name, you'll say it, of course.
Are you talking like way early history?
Alexander the Great, right? Alexander the Great went from here, he took over, he fought the Persians, he beat them, but he didn't defeat them completely. He goes down the coastline, defeats everybody there, he goes into Egypt. By the time he gets to Egypt, the Egyptians are so impressed that they just simply accept him. They don't even fight him. So he takes Egypt, and then from this, he's got this huge giant army. He goes back up here, totally defeats the Persians. So now he has Greece, Egypt, Persia. And because he has this, and he's like 28 years old, 29 years old, he then decides, let's not take over let's not stop here. Let's go ahead and take over the whole world. So he starts going towards India, as far off as pretty much the the Indus River, which is kind of on this side. Remember, there's two rivers in India. One is the Indus, the other is the Ganges. Okay, the Indus is where the old Indus civilization was, but that's not the heart of India. Where's the heart of modern day India today? It's the Ganges. It's right over on this side. It's on the eastern side. Okay? He doesn't get that far. He comes over here, comes back. What happens when he dies? You know, he's fighting for about 13 years. He has this huge empire, largest empire the world had ever known at that point. He's dead. What happens?
His empire falls apart.
It does. What does it fall apart into? This makes sense, right? Wouldn't it fall apart into the regions that were there before he took them over? So you've got Egypt, of course. You've got Greece. You've got this Mesopotamia area. And then you've got this India area. Well, when the Middle East becomes Islam, they don't create countries from scratch. They take over what has already been there. So they just inherit the structures that were already there. So Alexander comes in and defeats, and it breaks up into pieces. It breaks into Egypt, into Greece, into Turkey, and into India. Who else comes in? Well, go ahead.
The Mongols.
The Mongols come in, right? Now remember, I mentioned this a little bit, the Mongols have no depth of cultural identity. They are horsemen. They took over China, and so what religion did they become? Thank you. Buddhists. They take over India, and what religion do they become? Not all of it. You remember, the Mongols are kind of the north. They go across the steppes, because that's what they are. They're horsemen along the steppes. The steppes is like the Great Plains, very much like our plains here in the Midwest. And so they don't really go down south. This was something that Alexander the Great, but they do, they cross here. So in India, what do they become? Hindu, right? In the Middle East, what do they become? Islamic. And in Russia, what do they become?
Orthodox.
Orthodox. Okay? There's no depth there. They rule for about 100 years, just about 100 years, and then it all collapses. Then what comes in?
The Ottoman Empire.
Okay. Well, the Turks, remember, right next to the Mongols, they kind of follow the same path. So what you have here are divisions that have all sorts of influences. One of the main divisions is this area here. Whoops, I'm going to do this one, which is really kind of the Mesopotamian region. This section here. Then we have India. We have Egypt. We have this area. We'll talk about this, but the Muslims in the 700s, when they were pushing back the Byzantine Empire, they took over Spain. So you have a place there. And then you have these places that are kind of up to the north and in between. And these were developed by the Mongols. And you also have a little place here. Now, in our modern language, what are the names of these countries? You what?
What did you ask?
The stands are up here, Kazakhstan and stuff, but these two spots, you know them, they're in the news every single day. Iran and Iraq, right? So which is which? Syria is over here, right? And then you have Iraq, then you have Iran, then you have Pakistan and India. Okay? So where did these guys go for? So let's take a look at this. Mughals. Where are the Mughals? Very close to that, right? They're going to be here. What about the Safavids? They're going to be here. What would be like modern Iran area or Iraq? What about the Eastern Khanates? Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, all the stands, right? So they're over there. Well, what were the Ottomans? If you were to describe Ottomans, the Ottoman Empire, there's another word that is often with the Ottomans. You've got the Seljuk Turks, and then you have the Ottoman Turks. So where are the Ottomans at? Right here. And so if these are all regions, who's going to be mostly influenced by Europe? And in fact, Turkey, even today, is a really weird country. What's weird about Turkey? What's the religion in Turkey?
Is it divided?
They are Muslim. But what do they also have a very long tradition of? Keeping in mind, how did Turkey even become Turkey? Remember, before it was Turkey, before it was called Istanbul, what was that city called? Constantinople. Before it was Turkey, what was the country? Byzantine Empire. What was the religion? Strongly Christian. When the Turks come in, do they kill every single Christian?
No.
Of course not. You never do that if you take over another country. So there's a certain level of coexistence. Israel always has had Christians in it. Egypt has had long periods of Christians in it. Even in the Middle, Iran and Iraq, until recently, they've always had long periods of Christians in it. Recently, they've been horribly persecuted. But they've always been there. And so Turkey is kind of weird because not only does it have this Muslim contingent, it has a very strong Orthodox contingent. Greek Orthodox. They're so close between where Greece is and where Turkey is and where the Europeans are, and they have a connection to Russia. They are heavily influenced, and yet they're not European. They're Middle Eastern. You go into their cities, they're Middle Eastern. It's a different flavor. Its dominance is Islam. And so then we have a distinction between the corporate knowledge base that used to be Roman, but is now completely different. Egypt. Egypt used to be the source of our greatest library, Alexandria, right? Does it seem Roman today? No, it's not. It's very much Middle Eastern. Even Spain, I don't know if you've been to Spain, but there are parts of Spain. Some parts are very, very Catholic, very, very churches everywhere, but there's other parts that are what? Very, very kind of Middle Eastern, especially along the coast, especially on the interior. It doesn't seem as European. It's different. I'm saying this mainly to understand kind of a tonal quality between these three regions. And it has everything to do with this religious development. Okay, good, no problem. Let's go back just 2 seconds before we get into this. So, what was the Industrial Revolution again?
This is which from human labor to machine labor.
Yes. Okay. Where did this begin?
England.
In England. Okay. In fact, not just in England, but let's be even more specific. It's in the western part of Europe. And so, Industrial Revolution begins over here. If we look at Europe kind of as this big section, you have it divided kind of in the middle. And industrialization begins in the far western part. What's happening in the east? This isn't a Western civilization class. I don't want you to get too overwhelmed by this. But there's big differences. The United States were mostly English. Is there a difference in the political culture of the United States from Germany? Oh yeah! Russia? Yes! What's the difference? Where does our famous phrase, we hold these truths to be self-evident that all men are created equal, bound by their God, John Locke. Why did he write this? It was the English Revolution, right? He had no idea about the United States. He was certainly not thinking about the United States. He was talking about why the British Parliament should get rid of the king, at that time King James II. We hold these truths to be self-evident. Okay? Very English. Thomas Jefferson takes these up 100 years later because they're so English. Because everybody in the Parliament knew exactly what he was saying. He's writing this letter to them. And they know this. They recognize John Locke. This is not a shock. What was it that distinguished England from Russia that made the English Parliament system different? Well, part of it had to do with the advance of their political state. Feudalism, I mentioned, feudalism is what dominated the Middle Ages. Did it just shut off in 1500? No, it takes a long time. Where does it shut off first? Where are the first modern nation states? East or west?
West.
West is where it first comes up. And this is going to confuse you a little bit. I don't want it to, but I know it's going to. Does orthodoxy promote modern nation states or feudalism more?
Feudalism.
Why?
Because it has local leaders, local authority.
Very good. And because in the West, there really is a separation between church and state. if the church has just one leader and it's unconnected to the local politics, that means that the local politics can pretty much rise up on its own. And in fact, we talked about this, isn't that really the whole story of the Protestant Reformation? Trying to break free from the authority of the church. The church has no military, they're not having to fight the church, but they're still an authority of the church. And so as each modern nation state kind of rises up, they're breaking away from the authority of the Pope. And that's what defines the Protestant nations. This change happens most in the West. And it's not a shock that as we shift more to the West, industrialization is most found in modern nation states. Because remember, industrialization is about mercantilism. It's about money. Feudalism, no money, right? And so then when we look at Europe, the further east you go, the more bound up in feudalism you are. That's what makes Russia kind of so weird. Even in the early 1900s, under the Tsar, most of Russia is mostly feudal. There are little plantations, little manors, the peasants are working. You have a few areas, a few spots where there's urban spots, but most of Russia is urban. It's like feudalism. You go all the way to the west, in France, highly urban. But you still have this peasant, you still have this kind of a feudal backlog. It's one of the reasons why their French Revolution was so harsh, is that it wasn't a unified culture. England, on the other hand, almost entirely urban and industrialized. And of course, if we go even further west, what's the United States? Do we have any feudal history at all? No. Totally none. Does it take us any difficulty to embrace industrialization? Sweeps through. The only difficulty with industrialization, it starts in England first, is that in the United States, New England becomes industrialized. Well, why isn't the entire country instantly industrialized? This is an easy answer if you think about it.
Because we're a big country.
Because we're a big country. What are we doing? Like, entirely from 1800 to 1900.
Exploring the West.
Totally going west. That's exactly it. Constantly going west. And so it's not until we've gone all the way west that suddenly the exploration is done, that's when we really become industrialized. That's where we pick up in U.S. history. Industrialization is from 1870 to around 1920. By 1920, we are an industrialized society. We're also huge. And because of our industrialized society, we have a totally different infrastructure. We can get on my little moped, it can only ride on highways, and I could drive it to California or to Florida, because there's always going to be a road for me to be on. I promise you I cannot take that moped in Russia and go from one coast to the other. My little moped has a range of what? Maybe 90 miles on 1 gallon of tank. I know in the United States, with less than every 100 miles, I can find a gas station everywhere. Russia? No. What's the difference? The United States was industrialized from the beginning. And part of industrialization is shifting human labor for mechanical labor. And so you need to feed the mechanical labor. You need infrastructure. You need the railroads. You need the cars. You need transportation everywhere. You have it because the United States, modern nation state. What about Russia? Russia's got this huge expanse. Well, most of its population is right here. If they get some industrialization, it's in a few of the cities right there. Bulk of Russia, still very feudal. No industrialization. They don't really get industrialization until the 1960s and 70s. Same thing with China. Doesn't really get industrialized until the 1990s and this last decade. Because it's just so vast. And it has a great deal to do with that politics. And if you're not industrialized, then what happens to that cry, that demand to change the government? There is a relationship between your religion and your identity, but there is equally a relationship between this economic system and your identity. Western Europe, not only was it Catholic, but it's Catholic and Protestant, modern nation states, highly industrialized. Eastern Europe, less industrialized. Orthodox, more feudal. You come back over here, it's polytheistic. It's not quite feudal because it doesn't have that tradition, but is it really a modern nation state? Yes, it's a nation state. Is it a modern nation state? Or is it actually a little bit closer to what we would have expected if we went back maybe 500 or 600 years? If we were talking about the Byzantine Empire, or the Roman Empire, or the Greek Empire. Industrialization was very slow out in this side. We talk about mercantilism as kind of the vehicle or the motivation for spreading industrialization throughout the world. What's the theory of mercantilism?
Wealth is found in profit.
Found in profit. Individually, that means you buy and you sell, right? As a country, that means you want more gold coming in than goes out. Which, how does that impact the world relations? Trade, what are you trying to develop all around the world? Colonies, trading ports, all over the world. And so that forces a certain level of cultural diffusion because you're constantly trading. That's Europe going out everywhere. That's colonization. And it's directly tied to industrialization, which is tied to mercantilism. Gotcha. Now, let's talk about the Near East. Now, let's talk about the Near East. We call this the Middle East. Technically, it's usually referred to as the Near East, because what's the Far East? China, Japan. So where's the Middle East? Oddly enough, you might call it India. Nobody calls India the Middle East. So sometimes people refer to the Middle East, sometimes they refer to the Near East, and when they say that, it's because they don't want to confuse that. It doesn't matter. You got it. Let's look about where we're seeing here. In the time of Alexander the Great, you're looking at hot spots of civilization. What Alexander the Great does is he combines all of them. Then he dies. This is important because when Rome pops up here in the little footprint, this is Greece, pops up here in the little footprint, and starts taking over parts of Greece, and starts taking over here, he helps to create kind of a single entity. When we think of Western civilization, our first roots are here in Mesopotamia and here in Egypt. And then immediately we say, and then Greece. And Alexander was what combined Mesopotamia and Egypt and Greece together. He helped to create them together, so it was one pot. But then you've got all of Europe. And what happens is after the fall of Rome, this area becomes kind of independent. A little bit. When Alexander dies, this is one section. This is one section. This section here is a little bit different. It grows up by itself. It's never again taken over. The Romans never take that spot over. And as the focus, the center of civilization gradually moves west, it goes from Greece, then it goes to Rome, then it goes to the Holy Roman Emperor with Charlemagne and Europe. And frankly, you could argue that it's moved off to the United States. That center and west has moved west, west, west. Well, what happened to these guys that left behind? They continued to develop on their own. That's the Middle East. That's the Near East. Okay. By 700, it becomes Muslim. How does that happen? This is Alexander's empire. Here, here. Not here. Why not here? Big giant desert. Not until you learn how to domesticate the camel can you figure this out. And that's not for another probably 1,200 years. Okay. So this is slow. During Rome's time, this is Rome. This is Israel. Mesopotamia kind of becomes its own middle spot. We call it the Parthian Empire. And it develops on its own, but it also still has kind of divisions. So over here, close to India, this is going to be Kush. This is what's going to eventually be Iran. This will be Iraq. There's no main country here. It's just cultural developments that are separate. They've been developing separately for a very long time. How does this matter when they all become Muslim? Saudi Arabia. This is right before the rise of Islam. This is still uncivilized. It's groups and bands. But I told you they had domesticated camels, and so they're moving through here, and they're cutting corners, and they're going along the coast. And there's people in here, but they have no political tradition. They are defined by their tribal connections, right? This is basically feudalism without an extra state. each little house, each little dynasty, each little tribe is your own source of law. These guys already have some structure. What happens when Islam comes in? Muhammad is a trader, and he moves from Mecca to Medina and around here. And in this middle path, he gets this vision from the angel Gabriel. It happens over the course of, say, 20 years. And he's writing these things down. He doesn't actually write them down at first. You may not realize. Quran means recitations. This is what Gabriel told to Muhammad. And he's telling his followers. In fact, they have to memorize everything he says. And he makes them memorize. And when he dies is when they write it all down. That's what the recitation is. He's not sitting there writing these. And he's creating them at the time. I don't know if you ever looked at the Quran, but it's not a chronological thing from this beginning to the end. It's just a collection of stories. And so sometimes they go out of order because they came from very specific points. And people who are Muslim, they know, well, this was in the beginning of the recitations. This was towards the end of the recitations. Because that's not how it was. Yes?
Now, there's another...
And that's not a flippant answer. That's exactly what their answer is. Go ahead.
There's like another portion of scripture in Muslim religion, right? It's like verbal.
Okay, it's called commentary. So here, you have this recitation, the question, well, why did they write it down at the time? Well, because he was getting these recitations, and frankly, he was reacting to the moment, so some of these things would change at the time. It wasn't until he dies that there's no more recitations. That's when they write it down, and they don't put it in order, because he says, well, that's the way God gave it to us. So these are absolutely the words of God. This is not quite the same as the Hebrew Scriptures. We, and the Christian Scriptures, we believe that God spoke to all these writers, but he didn't say, this is what I'm telling you. He spoke through people using their gifts at the time. So he influenced, and we call it inspiration. And we believe that God has power in this, and so they said this, but it wasn't a, hey, this is what I'm going to write. The Muslims believe, Angel Gabriel said it exactly, word for word, nothing can be changed. So if it's in that order, that's the way it puts it. That's the way Muhammad said it has to be. That's the way it has to be. Now, it's actually a much deeper political reason for this. And I think I talked about this a little while back. For Islam, there is no separation between church and state. There is no separation. This is because of how it forms. There is no politics here. It's all tribal. So one of Muhammad's primary goals is to put God's law above tribal law. The definition of Muslim is one who submits. Submits to what? To God. God's word is unchangeable. It is exactly as it is. If you are not following this word, then you have no place with God. You are either following it, which means the politics has to follow it too, God's law above human law, or you are already an infidel. You're a dead man walking. Why is this a big deal? How does this impact politics in the movie?
Very strict.
Yes. Can you say, well, I don't know that I like this part of Islam, I'm going to change it. You either take it or you leave it, right? And if you don't follow it, then you're not part of it. And so you can't be in the country. You can't be a part of the government. Now, it doesn't mean that they eliminate all the Christians or anybody else, but it does give them a justification that there are the people that God is speaking to and that follow God, that have submitted themselves to God, and then there's everybody else. This was critical in combining the different tribal forces that are in Saudi Arabia. But what happens when Islam died? Or when Muhammad dies? I talked about this. Immediately what happens?
War.
Between who?
The United Tribes.
They're kind of like tribal war, but they don't ever call it tribal war. But there's the people that belonged to Muhammad's tribe.
Oh, isn't there like Muhammad's son and then Muhammad who he chose?
Yes. There are people that follow Muhammad's tribe, his son, and then there's the people, because remember he wasn't about tribalism. So there's somebody from a different tribe that he chose. This is the difference between the Sunni and the Shiite, and it starts immediately. Immediately. And so if you have two different versions of Islam, this is not the same as differences within Christianity, because Christianity does not believe in a theocracy where there's no difference in church and state. In Christianity, there is a division. There's a separation between church and state, not in Islam. And so these theological wars always turn into political wars from the get-go. And for the first couple hundred years, you had different regions. Baghdad was invented basically as a new source of power for the beginning of this Islamic. It's not here in Arabia. Why doesn't Mecca become like the new big capital? Even because that's where he was from, right? It's an easy answer, by the way.
Because of the desert.
It's desert, right? There's no resources. This had always had some politics. This is right there along Mesopotamia. This is, in fact, some of the oldest sources of our civilization. So it's already got an infrastructure. This becomes a new capital. It also happens to be kind of along the Silk Road path of exchange in terms of trade. And what was Muhammad? He's a trader. It went very easily into their religion, so trade is really big. So this becomes one capital. Cairo becomes one capital. As they move across in the 600s, Cordoba in Spain becomes a capital. All Islamic, not the same. They don't believe in clergy in the same way that we believe in clergy. They don't have popes or bishops or anything like that. They have each individual. But they do have a hierarchy, a very distinct hierarchy, and there's a political connection between the famous teachers and the heads of the tribes. Because there is no separation of church and state in Islam. And so when they're fighting with each other, whatever is underneath that particular ruler, that's the brand of Islam that you have. I don't know if you understand this with the modern things when the Shia and the Sunni are fighting with each other. It's as much a political issue as it is a religious issue. The fact that you sometimes have political Shia and Sunni under the same region is totally unusual, and largely it's because of some of the dispersions that occurred during the wars. So now we go into colonization. So this is kind of where the origins of these Islamic connections. But there's a politics here. This region here, this is the Byzantine Empire. This is going to be the Turks. They're going to be heavily influenced by the West. Do you think they are going to be more rigid in their Islamic orthodoxy or less?
More.
Why?
Because their politics. Their church will say is
Threatened, right? Yes, it's a good argument, but it's the opposite. They have a stronger political system. So if they have a stronger political system, do they have to rely on religion to keep them united? Isn't that kind of what the origin of Islam was in Saudi Arabia? They had no political state, and so you needed a really, really strong religion to keep it united. But when they take over the Byzantine Empire, they don't tear down those cities, they just move right in. There's already a state right there. So they just become the new heads of these states. So what is the religion? It's just kind of what they are. So does it have to be stronger, or can it be weaker? Can it be a little bit more flexible, should be the best term. It can be more flexible. What about Cordoba off there in Spain? Did Spain have a political tradition before it became Islam? Yes! More or less rigid in its Islam? Less. Same reason. What about Egypt? Does Egypt have a political tradition? Yes, very old. Not modern nation state, so I don't want you to be confused. It's not modern West, but it's an old tradition, right? So yes, stronger or more flexible? More flexible. What about Saudi Arabia? Stronger, rigid religion, or a little bit more flexible?
rigid.
Very rigid. Because where is the political state here? Even today, is there really a political state there? It's the heads of the tribes that are in charge of Saudi Arabia, Yemen. Okay, very weak political state. So the religion has to be stronger in order to keep it together. Go ahead.
Especially the political stability, the stronger the political stability, the less important religion is.
Yes, that's exactly. So when you're Britain and you begin to colonize, where are the areas that you're going to have the hardest time with?
Super strong religious areas.
Yes. And the ones that have a strong political system, you can handle politics. Modern nation states, we can deal with this. We can deal with Turkey. We can even deal with kind of Egypt, although it's not nearly as united as Turkey is. We can certainly deal with Spain, although we got rid of them by that time, so Spain is now Christian. But what about Saudi Arabia? Much more difficult. If you ever watched this story, Lawrence of Arabia, it's about how England is trying to kind of unite all these different tribes in the early World War I. It's a fantastic movie if you haven't seen it. Why am I talking about this? England's approach is totally defined by this religious tradition of Islam. When they come in to India, it's going to be a completely different approach. One of the approaches that they have with the Middle East is to focus on whatever the local politics is as best as possible, and then somehow hope that in the religious areas, in these confluted areas, they can find one person that they can hook onto. Because there's no way that they want to get into this mess. In India, they just developed their own colony. In China, they deal with the Chinese government. Because fundamentally, what's the primary goal of mercantilism under the British colonialism? That's it. We'll talk about this a little bit on Wednesday. Questions, comments, wisdom?
So was the Middle East ever taught?
Not completely. English had a huge influence on Egypt. England had a huge influence on basically defining all this. But they never set up like a colonial government. Good question.